Sometimes the most powerful stories come from the most unexpected people. When you think of the ancestors of Jesus, you might expect kings, prophets, or holy men of Israel. But tucked away in the genealogy of Christ is Rahab, a Canaanite woman, a prostitute, and a foreigner. At first glance, she seems like the last person God would use in his divine plan. And yet, her story is not only remembered, it's celebrated as a turning point in salvation history. Today, we're going to take a closer look at Rahab's story. Why does her name matter in the Bible? Why would God choose her of all people? And most importantly, what does her story reveal to us about faith, redemption, and the way God works in our own broken lives? Stay with me, because this story isn't just about history. It's about hope, second chances, and a truth that could change the way you see yourself. Setting the stage, Rahab's world. Let's rewind to the time of Joshua. Israel had just escaped slavery in Egypt and wandered 40 years in the wilderness. They stood at the edge of the Promised Land, looking toward Jericho, the fortified city that stood in their way. Jericho wasn't just any city. It was a fortress with massive walls that seemed impossible to penetrate. For Israel, it represented an impossible obstacle. But for the people living inside, it was home. And inside that city lived Rahab. Now, Rahab's identity is crucial to this story. She wasn't an Israelite. She was a Canaanite, a people group Israel was commanded to drive out because of their pagan practices. On top of that, she was a woman in a patriarchal society, and not just any woman, but one marked with social stigma, a prostitute. It's easy for us to imagine how society would have looked at her, someone to be dismissed, judged, and excluded. But here's where the story flips. God takes this woman, someone considered an outcast, and positions her right at the center of his divine plan. The act that changed everything. In Joshua chapter 2, we read about two Israelite spies who secretly enter Jericho. They're on a dangerous mission to assess the city before Israel attacks, but things quickly get risky. The king of Jericho finds out and sends soldiers to capture them. Where do the spies hide? In Rahab's house. And here's the twist. Instead of handing them over to the authorities, Rahab does the unthinkable. She hides them on her rooftop under stalks of flax. Now pause for a second. Think about how insane that was. Rahab had no reason to help them. In fact, she had every reason to betray them. The safe move would have been to protect her own people, her own city, and her own life. But Rahab saw something deeper. She had heard stories of Israel's God, the Red Sea crossing, the victories in the wilderness, and she believed. Rahab told the spies, "I know that the Lord has given you this land. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." Joshua 2:9-11. That's not just bravery, that's faith. A real-life parallel. Her decision reminds me of another powerful story, this time from World War II. A Dutch woman named Corrie ten Boom, along with her family, hid Jews in their home during the Nazi occupation. Like Rahab, she risked her life to protect people who were marked for death. She could have stayed safe, but she chose courage. And that act of faith changed countless lives. Rahab's story is strikingly similar. She risked everything, her safety, her reputation, her future, because she believed in a God she had only heard about. She hadn't seen the Red Sea split with her own eyes, she hadn't walked through the wilderness with Israel, but she heard the stories and made a choice. The Scarlet Cord, a symbol of salvation. As a sign of her loyalty, The spies told Rahab to hang a scarlet cord from her window. When Israel attacked Jericho, her household would be spared. That scarlet cord became more than just a marker for the soldiers. It became a symbol. A rope of red stretched across her window, pointing us forward to something much greater. Doesn't it sound like a foreshadowing of the blood of Christ? Just as the Israelites in Egypt were saved by the blood on their doorposts during Passover, Rahab's family was saved by the scarlet cord. Now here's why Rahab matters for us. Rahab teaches us that faith is not about where you start, but where you place your trust. She didn't born into the right family. She didn't have a clean past. She didn't even have years of training in the ways of Israel. What she had was a moment, a chance to act on what she believed. And she took it. That's what makes Rahab unforgettable. She didn't let her past define her. She didn't let her circumstances paralyze her. She acted in faith, and that act not only saved her family, but tied her forever into God's plan of redemption. Have you ever felt disqualified? Like your past was too messy, your mistakes too heavy, or your story too broken for God to use? If so, Rahab's story is God's way of whispering, "You're never too far gone." I remember meeting someone years ago who had been incarcerated for nearly a decade. Society labeled him as nothing but a criminal. But after encountering Christ in prison, he devoted his life to serving others. Today, he works with at-risk youth, helping them avoid the same mistakes he once made. Just like Rahab, his past didn't qualify him. It became the very platform God used to reach others. Transition to what's next. So, in this first part of Rahab's story, we've seen the setting, the stigma she carried, and the daring act of faith that changed her life forever. But her story doesn't end with just survival. In fact, the most shocking twist is still to come. This Canaanite woman, once labeled a prostitute, ends up woven into the very bloodline of Jesus Christ himself. And that's where we'll pick up in part 2. Because Rahab's name isn't just written in history, it's written in redemption. In part 1, we discovered Rahab's daring act of faith, the moment she hid the spies, trusted in the God of Israel, and hung that scarlet cord from her window. It was a turning point that not only saved her life, but also altered the course of history. But Rahab's story doesn't end at Jericho. What happens next is even more extraordinary because it shows how God weaves broken pasts into his masterpiece of redemption. From survivor to believer. After Jericho's walls fell, Rahab and her family were spared, just as the spies had promised. But survival wasn't the end game. The Bible tells us Rahab was brought into the camp of Israel, and she stayed. Imagine that, a Canaanite woman, once a symbol of everything Israel was supposed to separate itself from, now living among God's chosen people. It wasn't just geography that changed, it was identity. Rahab went from being an outsider, a foreigner, to becoming part of the community of faith. That transition is huge. It reminds us that belonging to God is not about where you come from, but who you put your trust in. Rahab in the genealogy of Jesus. Here's where things get really fascinating. Centuries later, in the Gospel of Matthew, we're given a genealogy of Jesus Christ. And right there, tucked among names like Abraham, Isaac, and King David, is Rahab. Matthew 1:5. Think about that. Of all the women in history, God chose to include Rahab in the line of the Messiah. She married Salmon, became the mother of Boaz, who later married Ruth, and from that line came King David and eventually Jesus himself. This is stunning for two reasons. One, Rahab was a Canaanite. God didn't just tolerate outsiders, He included them in His plan. And 2, Rahab had a broken past. But in God's story, her past didn't erase her future, it amplified His grace. Real-life parallel, the power of inclusion. This makes me think of a real-life story I heard about a church in Chicago. For years, the congregation had been mostly middle-class and suburban. But one Sunday, a woman walked in, homeless, visibly struggling, and clearly feeling out of place. Instead of pushing her away, the church embraced her. Members not only helped her with housing and food, but also gave her responsibilities in the church. Over time, she became one of their most faithful leaders. Her story echoes Rahab's. God doesn't just save us from destruction, He gives us a place, a role, a legacy. Inclusion isn't just charity, it's the heartbeat of the gospel. Rahab in the Hall of Faith. If you still doubt Rahab's importance, look at Hebrews 11, often called the Hall of Faith. It's a chapter that highlights the great heroes of belief, Abraham, Moses, and others. And right there in verse 31, we find Rahab. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. This is extraordinary. Out of all the names that could have been mentioned, Rahab made the list. Not because of her pedigree, not because of her reputation, but because of her faith. That's what set her apart. And in James 2:25, she's brought up again, this time as an example that true faith is always accompanied by action. In other words, Rahab didn't just believe quietly, she risked, acted, and lived out that faith in a way that changed everything. The ripple effect of Rahab's faith. What I love about Rahab's story is it shows how one act of faith can ripple out for generations. Think about it. If Rahab hadn't taken that risk, her family might not have survived. If she hadn't believed, she wouldn't have joined Israel. And if she hadn't joined Israel, she wouldn't have become part of the Messiah's genealogy. Her faith didn't just change her, it changed history. And that raises a question for us. What kind of ripple effect could our choices of faith create? Maybe it's not as dramatic as hiding spies on a rooftop, but even small decisions, choosing honesty in a tough situation, extending kindness when it's not deserved, or standing up for what's right, can echo in ways we may never fully see. Personal story, modern-day Rahab's. I once interviewed a woman who had grown up in an environment of poverty, addiction, and constant instability. By all accounts, her future looked bleak. But one day, she heard a message about grace that changed her perspective. She turned her life around, went back to school, and today she works as a counselor for women in crisis. She told me something I'll never forget. If God could use Rahab, He could use me. If He could turn her house of shame into a place of salvation, He could turn my story around too. That's the power of Rahab's story. It's not just ancient history, it's a living testimony for anyone who feels unworthy or overlooked. Lessons we learned from Rahab's legacy. So what does Rahab teach us today? 1. Faith is available to anyone. You don't need a perfect past to have a powerful future. 2. God values action. Faith isn't just believing in your heart, it's stepping out, even when it costs you something. 3. Your story can impact generations. Rahab's faith didn't just affect her, it shaped the line that brought Jesus into the world. Building anticipation for part 3. And yet there's one more layer to Rahab's story we can't miss. Beyond the walls of Jericho, beyond her genealogy, there's a deeper message about redemption, grace, and how God transforms our brokenness into beauty.
We've walked with Rahab from the streets of Jericho to the genealogy of Jesus. We've seen how one act of faith turned a life of shame into a legacy of redemption. But the story doesn't stop there. Rahab's life points us to something even bigger, the heart of the gospel itself. Rahab as a foreshadow of redemption. When Rahab tied that scarlet cord in her window, it was more than just a sign for the spies. For centuries, readers have seen it as a symbol of something greater, the blood of Christ. Think about it. Just as Rahab's house was spared because of the scarlet cord, believers are spared from judgment because of the blood of Jesus. It's a foreshadowing, a glimpse into how God would one day save humanity, not through walls collapsing, but through a cross lifted high. This is why Rahab's story isn't just history, it's prophecy. It reminds us that God's plan for salvation has always been about grace, faith, and redemption. Rahab and the heart of Jesus' mission. Jesus often reached out to people that society rejected, the outcasts, the broken, the ones labeled as too far gone. In fact, one of his most famous moments was when he ate with tax collectors and sinners, shocking the religious leaders of his day. Rahab's inclusion in his family line proves that this wasn't a new idea. It was baked into the story of redemption from the very beginning. The Messiah didn't come from a spotless lineage. He came from a line that included outsiders, immigrants, and sinners. Why? To show that no one is beyond his reach. Real-life story. Grace for the unlikely. I once heard the story of a man who had spent most of his life in prison. He had done terrible things and society had written him off. But during his time behind bars, he encountered the gospel. Against all odds, he became a mentor to younger inmates, helping them find a new path. And when he was released, he started a program for at-risk youth, steering them away from the life he once lived. When asked what gave him hope, he said, "If God could use Rahab, he could use me. If he could put her in the line of the Messiah, then maybe my story isn't over either." That's the beauty of Rahab's legacy. Her story still whispers hope into broken lives today. Rahab and us, a call to live with courage. Rahab didn't know the full outcome when she hid those spies. She acted on faith, not certainty. And that's what faith really is, trusting God enough to act, even when the ending isn't clear. For us, that might mean speaking up when silence is safer, forgiving when resentment feels easier, or stepping into a new calling when fear tells us to stay put. Faith is always risky, but Rahab shows us that risk is worth it because God honors the courageous choices we make in trust. The bigger picture, from Jericho to the cross. Rahab's story reminds us of something profound. God delights in taking broken people and weaving them into his masterpiece. Jericho's prostitute became an ancestor of the Savior. That's not coincidence, that's grace. Her life shouts a truth we need to hold on to. Your past doesn't disqualify you from God's future. If anything, it makes his grace shine brighter. Lessons for today's world. So what can we take from Rahab's story as we face our own battles today? 1. Redemption is for everyone. No matter your past, your failures, or your labels, God offers you a new beginning. 2. Faith requires courage. Rahab risked her life to act on her belief. What risks might God be asking you to take today? 3. Your choices create ripples. Just as Rahab's faith shaped generations, your decisions of faith can impact lives beyond your imagination. Maybe you've been feeling like an outsider, like you don't belong, or like your story is too messy to be used by God. Rahab's story tells you otherwise. It whispers, you are not too far gone. You are not forgotten. You are part of a bigger plan. When we see Rahab's name in the genealogy of Jesus, it's as if God himself is saying, "See, I use the unexpected, I redeem the broken, and I can use you too." As we wrap up, here's the lesson I want you to carry with you. Faith is not about having a flawless past, it's about trusting God with your future. Rahab's scarlet cord became her symbol of salvation. What's your cord today? What step of faith is God asking you to take? Because just like Rahab, your story, yes, your story, could be the very thing God uses to bless generations you'll never meet.